The island's main church has been here for 150 years, built from the very coral that surrounds the shore. It's twisted and shattered, but still standing strong. For centuries, the people of Bantayan have endured natural disasters that were once called acts of God. The next generations may also face the legacy of acts of man.
If we are to look forward to the future, we have to take things into control. We have to control how we live and live more responsibly and be real stewards of this island. That kind of future, unfortunately, is not in our hands. That kind of future is in the hands of the much bigger, more powerful, more developed nations. We just can't continue to be irresponsible and suffer this kind of fate that we are suffering today.
If you'd like to help the Philippines' recovery efforts, go to the ABC Appeals page at abc.net.au/appeals. And you can donate online to many of the aid agencies working in the region. Next, the compelling interview series Keating. And over on ABC2, enter the wonderful world of gaming on Good Game.
We've saved the best for last.
Is that a camera?
In the final episode, we're filling the airwaves with the bits they banned.
Wasn't that naughty?
The show's so controversial, they've never seen the light of day.
Absolute outrage.
Until now.
You'll never get away with it.
Shock Horror Auntie, tomorrow, 9:30, ABC1.
Beware of the risen people, for we shall take what they would not give. They think their law is stronger than us, than a man's desire to be free. They would keep us in chains, but this is our land now.
An ABC1 movie event.
I should kill you now.
You should, but you won't.
The epic true story, The Outlaw, Michael Howe. Premieres Sunday, 8:30.
This is a recession that Australia had to have.
You've lived with it ever since, haven't you?
Well, I have, but again, let me live with the 22 years of growth and low inflation that followed. I think by 1990, Bob sees himself as a great man sweeping through the careers of the rest of us in his destiny. You know, God, give us a break. He basically never intended to ever give me the job. In the end, I had to execute him. Nation building is a hard caper, and I had to make sure this slothful, locked-up place finally became an open, competitive economy.
In its fourth year, the Hawke government's reform agenda is kicking in, with unintended consequences in the wind, and a treasurer pushing for even more fundamental change, and one eye still firmly on the top job. With his Prime Minister abroad, Paul Keating issues a blunt warning. Australia is living beyond its means and headed for third world status. Bob Hawke doesn't like it.
This is not a time to panic.
And nor do the markets. Can we flick forward to mid-1986 and your warning that Australia faced critical economic problems that could lead us to becoming a banana republic? In a nutshell, what was the problem?
The problem was the secular decline in Australia's terms of trade from 1965 or thereabouts. We've said before, but it's worth saying again, the terms of trade is an economic expression which compares the value of the things you sell compared to the value of the things you buy. The things we were selling, wheat, wool, grains, iron ore, coking coal, copper, lead, zinc, were going down in value, while the things we bought were rising in value. Colour TVs, VHS recorders, computers. So we were getting poorer. Every treasurer had ignored it. Too hard under the carpet, too hard under the carpet.
When did it really dawn on you? Not just that there was this process going on, but that this was going to be critical.
Well, when those big quarterly current accounts started coming out, these massive big quarterly current account deficits started to come out.
So that was early 86.
That was early 86. So, you know, the writing was on the wall. And so, I blurted the Banana Republic statement out on from a kitchen telephone.
In a country town.
In a country town on John Laws's radio program.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, you know, a Banana Republic.
I did it because, you know, you can't bottle up stuff like this. I mean, you can't on the one hand say, look, I'm having a new relationship with the public. We're going to give them something better than the dross they've been fed for 40 years. But by the way, we're not going to tell them about the massive decline in our national income. You know, in the end, you've got to spit it out. Now, OK, it might have been embarrassing for the government and put a monkey on my back, but it was a monkey I was prepared to wear.
To what extent did that put further strain on the relationship with Bob Hawke? Because you did exchange some pretty willing language at the time.
Well, look, it did, but I think it's probably worthwhile getting this whole period into context, Kerry, and there's a few things in the file worth happening. I mean, in the end, Bob at the time and most of the cabinet weren't interested in a remedial shift to the terms of trade. It was too hard. We'd just gone through 1985, the tax summit, the tax year and all that. So in May, this is the context. Paul Kelly writes a piece, Leader with a Leadership Problem. And he says this, the profound paradox of Bob Hawke as Prime Minister is that he knows what needs to be done yet lacks the drive to lead his government to the Rubicon. He is paralysed by inertia at the big decisions. Let me say on Bob's account, when he returned from Japan and we got back to the policies at hand, he supported the framework. You know, I could show you another newspaper where it says, you know, Hawke swings on side. So he would like me to, in some respects, not, as you say, do the bomb throwing, but he also liked the remedial policy. He also liked the fact that I wore a lot of the flak.
Can you remember what the mood was around the cabinet table as you were telling them they had to saddle up again for tough medicine in 86?
Well, it was a very conscientious cabinet, and the economic ministers knew this was on.
So why was it necessary, as part of putting the structure right, that you had to cut and cut and cut?
The argument went we should reduce the call by the government sector on Australian savings, and this then would, in a mathematical way, reduce the call by Australia on overseas savings and overseas debt.
And that, in turn, would be reflected in the current account?
That would be reflected, firstly in the budget and then in the current account. Yeah.
So then came the day in July when the Australian dollar plunged to its lowest level of 57 cents, an all-time low.
It's been a traumatic and topsy-turvy day for both the Australian dollar and the Australian economy. This morning, the dollar went on one of its most damaging dives, down to just 57 US cents.
According to the biographer John Edwards, you had a conversation with the Reserve Bank Governor Bob Johnson that day in which you sought his advice and he said, quote, frankly, Treasurer, I don't know what to do.
I said, what do we do now, Bob? He said, well, frankly, Treasurer, I don't know what to do.
How did you react to that?
I did a whole lot of very urgent things. I basically turned inside out our foreign investment policy. I changed the tax treatment of repatriated dividends and earnings. And I said, Bob, I'll make this announcement and you throw a ton of money at the rate.
Yeah, did that get you past the immediate problem?
It did.
With the 86 budget, what was the minimum you had to achieve, knowing the harsh judgments that would be made in the markets and the media?
No government in Australia had ever taken a program by program cabinet approach to outlays reductions as conscientiously as the Hawke government had done. And that had happened in each of these budgets and May statements. And as the task got bigger, it became that much harder. So by the time you got to August and finished the budget round at the end of August, you're paralytically tired. I mean, nobody in the Western world was doing this. No one would have a cabinet and a prime minister sitting there for 10 weeks a year going through line by line items of budgets. I remember talking to one of the British ministers about Tony Blair, and they said Tony Blair wouldn't sit for 1 hour in such a meeting, much less 10 hours a day for 10 weeks a year. And I'm thinking we've got to get down around 3.5 heading towards surplus. We want to reach the point where the government's call on Australian savings is zero at worst, and where we're saving in surplus at best. So I was heading, and it turned out I announced that it was 3.5 billion, and it got huge support in the marketplace, absolutely ginormous support. The Financial Review, I mean, you know, the dear old Financial Review called it Keating's remarkable budget, you know, which was not the kind of headlines I was normally getting from them. So it was hugely approved of, and the dollar surged to 67 cents on the back of it.
What were the political dynamics going into the 87 election? Because Labor hadn't been too flash in the polls, even though Bob Hawke was still pretty popular. But against that, John Howard, as opposition leader, was struggling with a divided party and Joh Bjelke-Petersen's destructive push to international politics.
And hovering is also the sort of kind of enmity of the foreign exchange markets on the dollar, you know, just hanging around there. Waiting to see whether Australia had the fortitude to sort of consolidate its position. And I thought politically, if we did and did it well, we would win off the back of it. Now, this was counter to the orthodoxy that you never won off budgets, but nevertheless, that's what I thought.
At the height of the campaign, you forced John Howard to acknowledge a serious accounting error in his tax package, which was just about the mortal blow for the Liberals in that campaign. Can you take me through the detective work that pinpointed where the hole was?
I put Department of Finance and Treasury onto costing the things, and in my own personal office. So I said, look, there's no way these numbers will stand up. If he could afford tax cuts like that, so would we, and we can't. Now, I don't care whether he's published these things or not. There's a hole in here somewhere, and I want it found.
There's a straight-out glaring huge mathematical error, which is not an issue of debate, which is worth $1,500 million to the figuring.
I am going to take it away and I'm going to analyse it, and when that analysis has been completed, I'll have something to say about it. The opposition accepts responsibility, and the person who's at the pinnacle of the opposition is the opposition leader.
And that was it. It was all over. I mean, I still have... This is one of my favourite front pages of 13 years of public life. And with a bit of theatre, I'm going to get it out. Howard, my sum's wrong. You know, there it was. I mean, I nailed him, and that destroyed his 87 election. Now, Howard beat me for the Prime Ministership in 96, but I beat him in 1987.
And I imagine there's every possibility that he has a favourite poster out of 96.
He has one, but I made him wait for the Prime Ministership 9 years. You know, I dogged him.
So Labor won its third election in a row. Bob Hawke addressed the Labor caucus after the win and thanked everyone for their contribution. Is it true, as he has since written in the book, that you sulked because he hadn't credited the particular part you played? In other words, he didn't single you out for praise.
I didn't sulk, but as I had set the date, set up the May statement and the savings, believing they would be popular, a massive set of tax and fiscal changes, and secured the support of the markets and convinced Bob to have the July election and then blew Howard's tax package to pieces, Bob stood up in the caucus and thanked every minister except me. And Kim Beazley, who was a great pal of Bob's, who shared the office next to me in the old Parliament House, came in and he said, mate, that was the meanest thing I've ever seen Bob do. Oh, they did.
Why bother raising a sweat?
I didn't raise a sweat. Bob's only said that in his book. I never raised any sweat.
Well, what he does say in his autobiography is that the 87 election marked the watershed in your relationship, that in your mind, quote, the time had come for Labor's most successful leader ever, him, to begin clearing the way for his successor, you, and the sooner the better.
I didn't necessarily want Bob to hand the thing over to me then and wasn't insisting upon it, but I wanted him to acknowledge that part of our arrangement of two leaders in the one bin was at some point he would, in an organised way, hand the leadership over to me. And I wanted him to acknowledge that in some way, which subsequently he did with the Kirribilli agreement after the 88 budget.
But Bob Hawke said that you had a sense of urgency about succession at that time, this is mid-87, because you believed Labor's time was running out. There was truth in that, wasn't there? That you had a sense of that.
Yes, there's some truth.
You were beginning to worry that Labor's time was running out.
There was some truth that this could have been our third and last parliament, that winning four we'd never done before, that winning four was going to be difficult. At least I wanted him to acknowledge that and have a real conversation about it, you know.
Bob Hawke said that your focus on becoming leader from then on came to distort your analysis of the historical record. And this is what he said in quotes. Before long, the version according to Paul was that single-handedly he had floated the dollar, deregulated the financial sector, run the Expenditure Review Committee, powered the government and won the elections. He was the prime mover and in all but name the Prime Minister. Now, is that all that far from what you did come to believe?
Well, in a very large measure, a lot of that was true. But I never at any stage have never diminished Bob's popularity and his contribution to the winning of 83, 84, 87, 90, etc. But it's clear from any reading of the public record who was driving the government from the end of 1984. Clear as day.
And these things were playing on you?
Kerry, if you're doing 10 weeks a year in an ERC meeting and you're sitting there with a sunshade on to keep the lamps from out of your eyes and sitting there with a pair of sunglasses to try and look at the white paper as your health's deteriorating, yes, they start playing on you, believe me.
The election was on the Saturday. I remember on the Monday night for Four Corners interviewing you where you laid out the beginnings of your microeconomic reform agenda.
Continuing reductions in protection. I think we need to do more there. I think we need to expose this economy to international pressures to get the best from it. And by focusing on those micro issues, as well as the big picture, the big macro issues of the economy, wages, the budget, all of that, complementing it, I think we'll make a lot of progress in the next couple of years.
Kerry, the whole internationalisation of Australia would have stopped stone dead if we'd have had flexible financial markets but rigid product markets. We had to open up the financial, the product and the labour markets, the three. This was the big opening of the product markets.
Now, you weren't alone in pursuing the tariff agenda, were you? There was John Button as Industry Minister, other key ministers like John Dawkins, Peter Walsh, Bill Hayden, a number of others would have broadly supported it, and Bob Hawke himself.
Indeed, but it was all about the quality and scale of it. And what I wanted was a tops-down cut, not an across-the-board cut. But what I was after was that everything above 15% fell to 15 and everything between 15 and 10 fell to 10. And that meant the very high tariffs all collapsed to 15, and where the great bulk of them were between around 15, they went to 10.
Looking now at the state of manufacturing today, the rust belts around the major cities, industries like cars and steel and shipbuilding still in trouble. So many skills lost, jobs exported to Asia. Are you still sure it was the right thing to do the way you did it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it advanced as donkey's years. I mean, imagine if we'd been trying to hold up. Do you know, Kerry, the price of the average rate of protection on a motor car, I think when I became Treasurer, was about 78% or 80%. I mean, you know how poor quality the Australian cars were? They were double their price. So ordinary working men and women were being asked to pay twice the price to put a car around themselves of very moderate quality. And that was also true of shoes, shirts, underwear, TCF, clothing, textile and footwear.
But many of those working people we're now staring at lost jobs.
No,
Many of those working people in factories and various jobs, skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled, gone.
Yeah, gone. You know what they found? A better job a week later in a growing economy with employment growth. We got them off the factory floor. The aim was not to leave them doing repetitive jobs on the factory floor, but to get them off the factory floor doing better professional jobs out in the big service economy of Australia. I mean, all these people got picked up.
You make it sound so simple. A week later, they had another job.
No, well...
you really think that's how it always works out?
I mean, the labour market in Australia had grown by 25%. We'd created 1.7 million jobs. And so people would... Adjustments in manufacturing...
But a lot of those jobs were in totally different sectors of the economy. A lot of those jobs were in the service sector.
But exactly. So what would you want to be? Line up at 7:30 in a blue collar or work in the service sector? And people said, thank you, I'll take the service sector. But again, they didn't lose their job overnight. It took a while. This happened... The tariff cuts were made between 88 and then to 91, and then we brought in the 91 package to 2000. So there was, you can say, 13 years of change, gradual enough, predictable enough, funded with assistance packages and jobs to take people up as they left. I mean, it was absolutely the right thing to do.
Did you ever meet any of these people on these assembly lines?
Oh, of course I did. You know, you see women, poor women, they'd be sitting there. You know, I remember talking to one woman at Glowweave and she had glasses like the bottom of Coca-Cola bottles. And I said, how are you, love? She said, oh... I've been here 30 years, she said, Mr Keating. She said, my eyes are gone. And, of course, sniffing up the lint off the cotton, you know, there's a little bit of fine lint every time the needle goes up and down on the machine. She said, no, it's ended up in my chest. And she said, I've got real chest problems and real eyesight problems. I mean, this is what slave labour was all about, under the tariffs and under the quotas.
Also, after the election, you were straight back into budget mode, but unlike the May mini-budget that got a big tick, your post-election budget in September of 87 was seen by some key critics as a lost opportunity. Keating going soft, risking growth that might prove too strong and open the door to the debt crisis again.
Yeah, well, this is a bit of some of the rabid financial commentators, but, you know, they were a dime a dozen, frankly. You know, they were a dime a dozen.
Well...
Wayfarers on history's long road.
That might be true of some, but it wasn't true of all. And I would suggest a respected economics commentator in Ross Gittins said of the 87 budget, quote, behind Mr Keating's apparent good housekeeping is a complacency born of fatigue.
The markets didn't agree with Ross, you know. I mean, I had to say, now, how'd you like that trick? And Ross would go, oh, that's not too bad. I'd say, well, what about this one? I'd do another set of balls.
He said that the risk you ran with that budget was that the economy would grow more quickly than you expected, spilling into imports and limiting the improvement in the current account deficit.
What happens? You get these confidence effects. All of a sudden, you've got a government that's actually bringing outlays back to where they were 25 years earlier. You've got a government that's bringing the budget into surplus. You've got a government with a competitive exchange rate. You've got a government with a falling wage share and a rising profit share. This lit off an investment boom. It just lit off an investment boom.
But at the same time, you were supposed to be trying to limit the boom, so it didn't become what it eventually did.
Yeah, but then what was he arguing? That the surplus should have been bigger? I mean, look, the truth is, they'd never seen a government like this in their lives. They should have been out there lighting little candles to us.
By May 88, you'd had another mini-budget, introducing tariff cuts and a 10% cut to corporate tax. Broadly, it was supposed to keep the lid on growth again, while paying down debt and foreshadowing tax cuts as a payoff for wage restraint. But coming up to the August budget, the economy was still running too strongly again, wasn't it?
It was, but the budget went into surplus by $5.5 billion. The first massive surplus of its kind. I think it was around 1% of GDP, or it might have been a little under.
Questions first or a bit of an overview? Overview? Well, this is the one that brings home the bacon. This is the budget that pulls the whole game together from 1983 onwards.
Is it true, as Paul Kelly has written, that you went into the 88 budget hoping it would be your last as Treasurer and trying to make it your best?
That's a possibility, but you've got to remember that the party had no inclination to change the leadership. None at that point. And Bob had shown no inclination to leave. So I was always first and foremost a realist, you know. So I did the May statement and I did the budget. It nearly killed me doing both. But I didn't think I'd end up leader of the party as a consequence.
I should point out that while you're talking about the way you were carrying the load of the economy on your shoulders as Treasurer and claiming the credit for a lot of the things that were happening, at the same time, Bob Hawke as Prime Minister was responsible for 27 ministers and their portfolios in overall terms. He was responsible broadly for foreign affairs.
Yep.
He carried a lot of that diplomatic load.
He did.
He was responsible for every brush fire that flared up. He was a big part of putting them out.
I would confirm that description, but not a problem. Not a problem. Of course he was.
You certainly scored some triumphant headlines out of that 88 budget on budget night or from budget night. But Bob Hawke made comments in two forums the day after the budget. One was a newspaper dinner. The other was an interview on television. And in one, he made a rather notable remark that he hoped to be back for another 6 of those post-budget dinners. Yeah. And in the television interview, he said that you weren't indispensable.
I certainly hope and I expect that Paul will stay. Now, I don't discount that, he could go. I certainly don't want him to. I want him to stay. I think he will. But being hypothetical about it, if he were to go, there are people of very considerable talent in the ministry and the position would be filled.
Well, of course I took exception because in saying he'd stay 6 more years, he's completely failing to understand the nature of his relationship with me and the government or acknowledge it. And secondly, he knows that I had done a superhuman task of getting that big May statement and all the tariff cuts and the rest of it into place and then lining up for another budget,
But what he has said since, and what others have said since who were part of his office, is that what was driving him at that point was that he was sick to death of you denigrating him behind his back all year to colleagues and journalists.
Well, I never denigrated Bob to a journalist ever. I never spoke to journalists about Bob. Never. In my own office, I'd give Bob a baggie if he did something badly in some ERC round or something, but that was it. I never ever took the debate outside of my office.
But at the same time, you know how Canberra operates. You know that indiscretion rules at least as strongly as discretion rules, gossip rules as much as secrecy, and the chances are that if the noise was there, then you were.
The fact is, I was doing for Bob and the government things no Treasurer had ever done before. Never before. And I really set up and won the previous election in the main, So what we needed was some acknowledgement by Bob and to sit down and talk about the future, which he patently refused to do. That said, I was so busy doing the May statements and the budget, the May statement, then the budget, the idea that I'm swanning around the press gallery, talking about Bob, it's just complete nonsense.
So tell me this, because in this period you also suffered a health problem, if I understand this correctly, in the shadow of the August budget.
It was such a shocking workload, and I had fundamentally the flu and a throat infection. I did a dinner in the evening. I was sopping wet, and the next day I went to a general practitioner and said, "Look, I've got to deliver the budget next Tuesday." At this stage, I had a badly inflamed throat and then a chest infection. He said, "I'm going to give you a wide spectrum antibiotic." And the next morning, in the early morning at 6:30, reading the newspapers in the quiet of Canberra, I hear the drug had given me tinnitus in the ears, the whistle in the ear. I'd run myself into such poor health in doing the thing and just struggled to get the budget done and do the thing. And the night after, Bob goes out and says, "I can do without him." I can do without him. I mean, I've got, Hawke signals he can live without Keating. I mean, I've got the same press statement, press coverage you looked at. I mean, the high indecency of it was manifest.
Is this where you said the relationship was dead in the water?
Something like that.
Well, he went back on television the next night.
That's right.
And sang your praises.
That's right. Well,
and
that was all pretty phony, but nevertheless, it sort of eased the public thing down.
You went to see Bob Hawke again, calmer atmosphere.
Yeah.
And out of that discussion, eventually, came the Kirribilli agreement. You, Bob Hawke, at Kirribilli House, and you'd insisted on 2 witnesses.
Yeah.
So basically, what took place at that meeting?
I was all very polite. We sat in the main drawing room at Kirribilli House, and Bob came, well, there's a bit of chit-chat, and then Bob came to the point, you know, that he said, everyone here is familiar with the discussions we're having, and look, I'm prepared to think about, at some point, me leaving voluntarily, and that would be, according to discussions he said I've had with Paul, that would be sometime after the 1990 election. But I said, the only thing I'd need is at least probably a year or more to garner a larger public profile as Prime Minister rather than as Treasurer. And but again, given the nature of the meeting and his gesture, I didn't want to press the point about what time in the 1990 Parliament he should leave.
We know now that a nasty recession was slowly moving on Australia like a malevolent storm front through this whole period. While the gods fought out their personal ambitions, looking back now, had you only been concerned about your day job, not angsting about leadership or personality conflicts, might you have seen that recession coming with a little more clarity?
It's a matter of record. I wanted interest rates to rise in '88 faster than the Reserve Bank moved them up. But the Reserve Bank had in mind the stock market crash of late '87 and the advisings from the Bank of International Settlements about a coming massive 1933 type stock market implosion. So the bank wanted to leave conditions accommodating, softer, lower interest rates. My judgment was that the economy had just run over the stock market hole like a pothole and that demand was taking off. So, but we were also trying to develop an independent Reserve Bank. So it was not like the old days pre-float where I could sort of ring the governor and say, look, Bob, I think you better shove the rates up. And the officers and the board didn't move the rates up till May '88, then only ever so quietly and by little. By that stage, the demand boom was off and running. It was by the end of '88, it was a house on fire.
But didn't you, in terms of that growing independence that you were fostering at the Reserve Bank, didn't you at some point say of the Reserve Bank, they do as I say, which implied the absolute opposite?
People misunderstood that. What I said was, look, in economic, I said I have the Reserve Bank on side, or I forget the expression. What I meant was we can affect fiscal policy, the budget, interest rates, the Reserve Bank, wages through an accord. In other words, we're an economy equipped with tools. That's what I was really trying to say.
Paul Kelly says that Bob Johnson, with whom you had a close relationship, was appalled by those comments, they do as I say, and didn't know whether to correct you publicly or resign. Did you two ever have a conversation about that?
I think I said to him, look, you know what he said, I know what you're trying to say, that we've got all the arms of policy ready and working. I said, yeah, well, I could have chosen the words better. I think he regarded that as a kind of an apology. You see, Kerry, in the actual operation of monetary policy under me, relations between us were entirely proper. In fact, this is an expression Bob Johnson used in his last speech. He said, I must say that relations between the Labor government and myself and the bank and its board over the period have been entirely proper.
Over 15 months through this period, interest rates went up by about 6%.
Today, as the Treasurer perhaps appropriately prepared to fly out to Paris, interest rates shot up to a level not even speculated about last month, a new record of 17%.
The Hawke government's high interest rate policy is aimed at stamping out Australia's long-running spending spree.
You must all have been stumped, really. Treasury, Reserve, you, your office, the Cabinet, not to mention the broader economic community, watching interest rates go up at that rate, but still not seeming to have an effect.
Well, the demand was just so strong. I mean, it was the biggest boom in 20 years or something like that, just an enormous boom. And nothing seemed to sort of slow it down, you know.
There was this kind of roaring 20s mentality going on in the markets and the banks. The country was awash with easy money. Free spending entrepreneurs littered the landscape.
Yeah.
Developers were running amok. The banks were lending like crazy.
True. The banks were trying to protect their base against the foreign banks. So they were bankrolling second and third rate propositions just so the foreigners didn't get any share of it, right? And it was in the first flush of deregulation, so
some of the people lining up for money were the spivs.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of spivery at the time, and a
lot of it was speculative.
Yeah, but a lot of it was productive too. And the fact is, we'd had low investment to GDP for donkey's years in Australia. All of a sudden, we've got our dream investments happening in a big way, but the problem was it was too big, too big.
In '88, early '88, you wanted a 2% increase in interest rates. You thought it needed to be a little bit on the blunt side.
Yeah. In '88, I wanted the bank to put the rates up by a big number and say so. In this period, Kerry, asset prices, housing prices were rising 20 to 25%. 20 to 25%. And I wanted the Reserve Bank to say, hey, this is going to stop. But instead of that, it took them till May to move it up 0.5 percentage point, and then they didn't announce it.
Now, John Phillips, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank at that time, who was part of all of those discussions, he has subsequently said that he remembers no difference of view amongst you at that time.
Oh, yes, it was. I mean, in the end, Russell was ringing, Don Russell, my private secretary, was ringing every week, saying to Phillips, John, when are you going to put the rates up? We've agreed at the last two board meetings to put them up. They're not up yet. And I finally got to the point. I told David Morgan, I said
So Dave Morgan was the Treasury person
officer
responsible for monetary policy.
I said, if Johnson and Phillips don't put the rates up soon, I will I will actually give them a parliamentary instruction to do it.
Can you remember what he said?
And he said, oh, well, I don't think we have to get around to that, Treasurer. I said, look, I can't take this obfuscation any longer, David. I mean, if all this stuff with John's going on about snugging and keeping the rates down, I said, the place is on fire.
One of the abiding images of Paul Keating through those years as Treasurer that every journalist, I'm sure, would agree, and many members of the public, was the man who loved painting on the big canvas, the man who loved pulling the policy levers. This was very much part of your act at the time.
Sure.
You might have been pulling levers, but they weren't working.
Well, I couldn't be in command of a big boom in commodity prices, and I couldn't be in command of a big boom in investment. After the stock market crash, then the boom in '88, arguments in the official family about whether we ought to keep conditions soft or not. Very hard for the Treasurer to say, no, I have all the answers.
So how hard was it in that climate to frame the 1989 budget for August of that year?
Because the big thing I had to do was put tax cuts in to stop another wage explosion. Let me just labour that point for a second. The whole system, because of the demand, was about to blow again, just like 1981 too. And Bill Kelty's trying to hold the damn wall back, and he needs me to help him. So what's he need? He needs big tax cuts. Just to give you an idea, at the Shell refinery in Melbourne, I remember Bill calling me to say that the Shell company had offered the workers in the refinery in Melbourne that year wage increases of 15%. 15. Now, just imagine what that would have done to the inflation rate. What I needed the ACTU to do was say, no, we won't take the money. Now, ACTUs don't do that. We won't take the money, we'll only take half the money. We'll take 7%, because that Mr Keating's going to give us $30 tax cuts in lieu. In other words, if we keep the discipline of 7, he'll give us $30 a week off his surplus.
Now, of course, one of the criticisms subsequently of your handling of the recession was that tax cut fanned the flames.
You know what that argument is? Trash argument. Had I not allowed Kelty to hold the damn war back, we would have been back to 1981 too.
John Edwards wrote just before the 89 budget that support for your policies of high interest rates and deep cuts was vanishing within a caucus that was facing an election within a year. Among economic commentators and the business community, the discord within Canberra was interpreted as a sign that Keating was losing control over economic policy.
Well, what happened was they all started to sort of wet their pants. That's what happened. They wanted, here's one, Keating resists push for mortgage relief. Richardson and people like that were telling Bob, look, we've got to make housing mortgage deductible like the Americans do. Now, you know how tax-preferred Australian housing is. It's not capital gains taxed. Imagine the sort of society we'd have if interest was deductible, right? So, but this was a big push. So I had to knock that one down. Then finally, it says the government to stick with Keating's policies. That's July 89. That's after I did the so-called Menzies Hotel speech saying, rat baggery is out. We're not going to sort of wet our pants and go for ratty policy, you know.
You're facing an election, as it turned out, in March of 1990, and by the end of 89, the Reserve Bank and you were in agreement that the boom was effectively over. What policy consequence was there of that?
It was then about getting the bank to lower the interest rates. And Bernie Fraser took over from Bob Johnson during this period, and Bernie wanted to keep the board together, and there was one recalcitrant, if I could use that word, member of the board. There was a guy called Gordon Jackson. He was the former managing director of CSR. He used to always get around in a black three-piece suit. I used to say to Bernie, he looks like a bad priest. Anyway, this guy would not agree to reduce the interest rates. And I said to Bernie, just knock this joker over. Oh, no, Treasurer, I've got to keep the board together. I think part of my job is to keep... I said, yeah, keep it, what, we'll have the economy burning to keep Gordon Jackson happy? I said, Bernie, cut it out, you know, cut it out. At any rate, Bernie got the better of them, but not until January 90. It's not till January 90 that the first interest rate reductions start. But, you know, we get there. Here it is here. Keating eases the screws, January 24, 1990.
Was there no political consideration about that election in your conversations with Bernie Fraser about pulling rates down?
Oh, God, there'd be a bit, of course. But I didn't want the economy burning. And then this is the killer point. See, business, this is the Financial Review. Business falls in with Labor's wages strategy. In other words, business is saying, thank you, Mr. Kelty and Mr. Keating, we agree with you. We don't want a wage explosion and we don't want to go back to 1981. And, you know, when you've got Labor and when you've got business, you win.
So March 24, 1990, Labor and Bob Hawke win their fourth straight election.
Yep.
That made Bob Hawke an absolute Labor hero, but you must have been feeling pretty good.
Yep.
And your relationship with Bob Hawke in the immediate aftermath of that 1990 election was solid.
Oh, happy days are here. I mean, you know, we're all together again, you know.
Interest rates tumbled through 1990.
That's right.
But it was too late. In November of that year, you fronted the press gallery with the declaration, this was the recession Australia had to have.
Yeah.
First thing to say is that the accounts do show that Australia is in a recession. The most important thing about that is that this is a recession that Australia had to have. That the spending we had in the 2 years up to now was unsustainable.
You've lived with it ever since, haven't you?
Well, I have, but again, let me live with the 22 years of growth and low inflation that followed. Okay, there's a deal. I'll live with it, but give me the credit for 22 years of low inflation and a flexible wages system thereafter and setting up the economy for a nearly quarter-century run.
This comment was not driven by the instincts of the Bankstown boy in touch with the public mood, was it? Perhaps more clever wordsmith with the love of the metaphor and the clever turn of phrase.
Yeah, I know, but I did. This is a point of dispute with Bob and me, where there is in fact no dispute. I didn't use the phrase without checking it with him, and I went round to see him with Don Russell, and Don Russell has a clear note of Bob saying, "Well, Paul, if you think that's a you know, okay, if you think that explains where we are, you know, I'll leave that to you." In other words, he didn't say, oh, no, don't use those phrases. Now, in his book, he says, oh, no, this was all Keating's doing. Let me be clear about this. I'm not blaming Bob for it, and I'm not putting it onto Bob. It was my phrase. But he was agreeable to me using it. And the reason he was that it was a recession we had to have, because had we not had it, wages would have been back to 1981 again. Now, would I have liked a softer landing? Yes. Would I have liked that sort of Reserve Bank to have put the rates up earlier in 1988 and got them down quicker in 1990? Yeah, 89, yes.
But in those terms, it wasn't the recession you had to have if the levers had been pulled correctly. It was avoidable.
I don't think you can just get the vernier dial in the Treasury and the Reserve Bank, so I don't worry about that. We'll have this. Just a nice slow landing for you, you know. It's not that easy.
But let me just come back.
If it was that easy, Kerry, every other country in the world wouldn't have recessions.
But you see, in your education of the greater Australian public about how economies work, you'd led us to believe that all you had to do was precisely that, just pull the odd lever.
Well, that's called good salesmanship.
Perhaps too good in this instance.
Maybe.
What responsibility, ultimately, do you take for that recession?
Well, I think you've got to take responsibility for the outcomes. You know, I take responsibility for, even though there was an independent Reserve Bank, and in the end they were, too slow up and too slow down, and the bronco effect of the terms of trade, this is just the hand you're dealt. And I think if you're the Treasurer, you have to take responsibility for it.
Last word on the economy with you as Treasurer. There you were at the height of the recession, March 91, pushing through a new round of tariff cuts. The climate could not possibly have been worse.
Yeah.
There must have been pressure on you not to do that.
Oh, yeah, well, nations, Kerry, nations get made the hard way. Nation building is a hard caper. And I had to make sure this slothful, locked up place finally became an open, competitive economy. And I would have broken my back to get those tariff cuts through, and I did.
In early December, you spoke at the National Press Club, end-of-year dinner, an informal affair where candour was encouraged on the basis that it wasn't reported.
Yeah.
Your Treasury Secretary, Chris Higgins, who'd you'd appointed the previous year, you're quite close to Chris Higgins. He died the night before.
Yeah.
What was your mood as you got up to speak to journalists that night?
Well, I was devastated about it. When you've been through so many policy battles that I'd been through with him, and the value of a guy like this is just phenomenal. And I think of all the sort of charlatans in the system, particularly in the political system, compared to a chap of his weight going, it really pulled me down, really pulled me down. Yet I've got the press club dinner, what am I going to say? What am I going to say? So I thought the lesson should be about essentially a sort of the value of leadership and the quest for leadership, of good public policy, and that leadership was everything, more or less in tribute to him.
Surely you'd have also been thinking about the implications of what you were saying as they might have been read by gallery journalists.
No, not really, because it was an off-the-record thing. It is the classic off-the-record end-of-year thing where people don't split on you. But more than that, I was unguarded in the thing. It was the real me speaking, and I wasn't thinking about how will this go here or how. I was just blurting this stuff out, and broadly what I'd said.
I was there.
Oh, you were there?
I was there. At the heart of your speech was your reflection on what great leadership was, and that Australia hadn't yet produced a great leader.
Yeah.
Wasn't it disingenuous to suggest that you wouldn't have seen the offence that Bob Hawke might take?
Australia hadn't had that leadership at the critical time. You see, what I'd said was, when the British were trying to defeat the colonists in the United States, the Americans had General George Washington, When the Union had come apart, they had, in the middle 19th century, they had Abraham Lincoln. And when finally robber baron capitalism collapsed and they headed into a massive depression, they had Roosevelt. I said, we've never had that kind of leadership.
Well, the great offence that Bob Hawke took when it was inevitably reported and recorded was that, in his eyes, you had slighted John Curtin, who he and many others regarded as the great Labor wartime leader of Australia.
The great offence was that I didn't compare Hawke to Washington, Lincoln and Roosevelt. That was the great offence, right?
What he was reported as saying to you and what he himself has said that he said to you
was... he talked about Curtin to me, yes.
His offence was that you had not acknowledged John Curtin as a great Australian
leader. He said that,
leader.
but that was only the prop for the greater hurt, that I hadn't recognised him, that he was like, the Christ child in Joseph's manger, whose mother had whispered in his ear at 5 years of age that he would be the great one, the great Prime Minister and the great figure in Australia. And so therefore I hadn't acknowledged his greatness, you see.
But you're imputing those thoughts to him.
Yes, I am imputing it because he broke the Kirribilli agreement off the back of this speech.
Why didn't you see that coming as a possibility?
Because it was not meant to affect Hawke.
But he is seriously saying that there was no point, no moment, such a supreme politician as yourself, with all the water that had gone under the bridge between you two, that he could not read anything into that?
No. When you heard it yourself, what did you think?
I can tell you what I thought and what an awful lot of other journalists were saying that night. We were reading those sentiments into what you were saying.
Yeah, well, maybe Chris Higgins' death, well, I'd say maybe, did overtake me. I mean, the sadness of it, but the value of his life. And I was sick of the flummery, you know, the nonsense, you know. I remember I talked about politicians. I said, a lot of you think we're not worth two bob, but politicians make the world. Remember me saying that? Politicians make or break the world. And I've offered you a new brand of politics and you've all, in the main, run with it. Don't give it up now. Please get this right. Bob always thought that he was a special figure in life. And whenever there's been commentary about that, was the way his parents treated him. And that's how would you like most parents to treat any of us. But
is there no point that you came to think of yourself as a special figure in life, and what's wrong with that, if it's in context?
I think Bob became a pathological narcissist. I think by 1990, Bob is a pathological narcissist. And he sees himself as a great man sweeping through the careers of the rest of us in his destiny. You know, God, give us a break. Give us a break. So finally, he rats on the agreement.
But before we come to that, just stay with that night for one more second. With those words that you're saying, and you're talking about the great changes you've made, and it's all in the context of great
He should have been on his hands and knees about me being around him.
And it's all in the context of great leadership. You didn't see yourself then as a great leader, a potentially great leader in waiting?
Well, I knew that I had a chance. Australia is not the United States, Kerry. I mean, what we do doesn't change the world. I mean, it's not to
Australia.
It's not to invalidate the point that leadership is central and that leadership is a key ingredient in public life. Not to invalidate that point. And that at principal moments in our history, we need that kind of leadership. That was my point. And Chris Higgins provided that kind of leadership and he died yesterday. That was a sort of sub-point, right? But Bob's used this speech to tell me formally in January that because of this speech, he's withdrawing his commitment.
Well, if it's true that Bob Hawke was at least half hoping for an excuse to renege on the Kirribilli handover, didn't you hand him the perfect excuse?
And would I?
He later said that it just, quote, increased his already strong feeling that you weren't ready for leadership.
Oh, he would say that, wouldn't he? He would have said that, wouldn't he? Look, he basically never intended to ever give me the job. That's the truth of it.
Well, these are your judgments.
In the end, I had to execute him. He should execute me, and in the end, I did.
I'm just rapidly casting forward here to a comment that was made by one of your colleagues at the time of the first challenge that it was a choice between an egomaniac and a megalomaniac, and I think the finger was pointed at you as the megalo.
Ah, well, look, let's say I'm a far more humble commodity than Bob is.
Just recount for me the moment you decided that you were going to challenge and how you were going to go about it.
It was really lining up for the budget round because then it would have been my 9th budget. And, you know, they were ginormous. They were full of structural changes. And Bob announced he was going to have a long trip abroad. So Muggins is still at the budget round doing the great man's work while he hears voices, you know, that he's the great national leader. The one I didn't acknowledge with Roosevelt and Lincoln, and you know, but nevertheless he's there. And I'm back to the toil. That's my place in life.
When you decided that you were going to formally challenge, what were the key steps you took?
The formal challenge decision didn't take long to make, and it was made late. So it's not as if but I really decided I wouldn't do the budget, so I was going to go. I was going to go as Treasurer. Whether I would go by challenging Hawke was a separate question. But in the end, I decided that I would.
And when you decided to go and see Bob Hawke, what did you say to him?
I said, Bob, I always told you if I was coming after you, you'd be the first person to know. and I'm now coming after you, and you are the first person to know.
What happened then?
Oh, he said, well, can't we discuss this? What are you got to go on like that for? Can't we discuss this? So then he had a long discussion about he would reconsider the position when he came back from abroad, and that he would think about maybe we could have another, get Richardson in and the others in, and we could have another round about, some transition arrangements.
You had that conversation, you walked out, and what, you announced the challenge?
No, I'd arranged for it to be announced. We gave Oakes on Channel 9, I think Richardson gave Oakes on Channel 9 the details of the Kirribilli agreement.
Mr Keating has said that Mr Hawke promised him he would step down after the 1990 election, after a reasonable period, but in time for his successor to establish himself as Prime Minister.
So that was with your agreement?
With my agreement. Now, Richardson backed me in that challenge.
Why wouldn't you just be upfront with the public of Australia, walk into a press conference, face the reporters' pens and the cameras, and lay it out? Why did that have to be a leak?
Well, it was a matter of timing, because it was a Thursday and the caucus was going to be up for weeks. I had to get in to see Bob, and there wasn't enough time. In fact, I'd only barely walked out of Bob's office. I don't know, not long before the Channel 9
Well, then you
news
must have had the strategy plan before you walked into his office. You must have had you must have had Graham Richardson prepared to give Laurie Oakes, in fact, almost certainly to have given him the document and the detail before you went in to see Bob Hawke.
That's right.
So he wasn't the first to know.
Oh, well, he was the first, substantially. I mean, in a political sense.
No, seriously. You said you'll be the first to know, and you are, but you had your troops banked behind you already swinging into action.
Yeah, but I mean, what I wasn't doing was out there months earlier trying to be rid of him. That's what I meant by that. I mean, I stuck to my word right through,
Did you think you had a serious chance of winning?
I thought I'd fall, substantially. I'd do all right, but I'd fall substantially thought. I mean, in the end, I can't remember the exact number. I think Bob got 66 or 7 or something, and I got 42 or 44.
Here's the thing. If it was so abundantly clear that you were already the real leader, that you were the drive of the government, that Bob Hawke was weary, his time had gone, if all of these things were obvious, why did the caucus vote him back?
Why did they? Because they thought that they might in some way slip through, hoping that I'd still stay in reserve. I think there was a bit of that to it.
Do you think it was also that they actually feared the grenade thrower aspect of your personality? The two sides to Paul Keating. The two sides to Paul Keating.
Thrills and spills, yeah.
Thrills and spills.
Thrills and spills. But always a thrill to try and get another big mark on the National Register.
Approaching Christmas 91, what was in your head about staying or going? What was winning?
Well, Bob called the Parliament back for one day to deal with a bill outlawing political advertising, and it was a very bad move for him. The members of Parliament who'd got up for Christmas have got a return for Canberra for one day only. On the night before the meeting, they come into my office and they find my supporters, Leo Macleay first among them, said, they looked around, there was nothing left. I'd taken all of my family photos, all the clothing, all the books. There was just the pencil sharpeners and the the A4 paper blocks. That was it, really. And they said, you're actually going. I said, where's all of it? I said, well, I've taken it to Sydney. And Leo said to me, what'd you take it to Sydney for? I said, because in January I'll go. I won't hang around like a bad smell through 1992 and ruin it for you all. So I'll go, I'm going. And Leo said, God almighty, right, where will we be then? So a great bunch of them then assembled in my office, which was, of course, empty, and said, oh, look, we've got to knock this bloke over. We've just got to knock this bloke over.
So are you saying that by Bob Hawke bringing the Parliament back for one day, it cost him the Prime Ministership?
Absolutely.
Had he not done that, you'd have been gone by January?
Absolutely.
What emotions did you feel as you heard the vote called?
You feel a big weight fall on you, but I didn't want to see Bob go in these terms. I was very sad to see Bob go down in these terms. And that's, you might think that's strange, but you see, there was a point of affection between Bob and me. You've got to know this. You're sitting in a caucus meeting, the other man is sitting defeated. And this is a man you've worked with for 8.5, 9 years of your life, for which you have a lot of personal affection and regard, right? See, in a television series of a kind, or television interviews of a kind that we're doing, none of this can explain all those soft moments in a long career, particularly between two people like Bob and me. But they were there. And I know what that means for me, what it means for my family, what it means for the caucus. So there's a very humbling moment. And if you examine my press conference immediately thereafter, it's very obvious that I am not some ebullient person who's just got a great victory. You know, I feel the moment.
Well, it's a great honour to be elected leader of the Labor Party. It's a very humbling experience, and I feel the poignancy of the moment.
What do you have to say?
Can you remember that night what you and Anita talked about? Because this was an event that was to change, already had changed your lives immensely.
Yeah, we did talk about it, and I'd said to her some of the things I said to you about Bob, and she said she was very tough on Bob, really. She said, Bob's just fiddled you around for years. There was a justice about all of this that had to be done. And at least the justice has been done. I, Paul John Keating, do swear that I...
You'd waited a long time for the power that only comes with one job in this country, and you finally had it.
You see, I always thought Australia could be a great country, but it had to have a different idea of itself.
Thank you for helping this man.
And I wanted to make the point that Gallipoli looked back at Britain, whereas Kokoda looked to our independence.
You've never visited Gallipoli, is that right?
No, and I never will. The notion that the country had to be reborn there is just the greatest piece of nonsense ever.
This is a victory for the true believers.
While there was a solid minority of people who loved you, there was also an equally solid minority of people who hated your guts.
Well, I lived in sweet equanimity about all that, Kerry. I had the economy ticking over like a Swiss watch.
Yeah, but when you say you had it going like a Swiss watch, unemployment had gone past 1 million.
They had enjoyed but 5 minutes of economic sunshine before the economic sky started falling in again.
The point was, I got the changes over, you see. I got the changes.
Next, Margaret and David agree to disagree at the movies. And over on ABC2, it's a tough life behind bars on Hard Time.
These conditions are almost identical to Victoria's Black Saturday.
Cyclone emergency in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland.
Having a hard time breathing now, it's getting really hot.